Hi everyone, it's me Dan. Welcome back to my channel. This is the Craft of Writing episode 5 and it's about micro descriptions. Now of course it's been a while since I've been on YouTube because I've moved across the globe. But in this series, I've talked about character dialogue tagging. I've talked about the structure of a novel, through line and parallel, through line and sequence, converging through lines. And I've shown an example of plotting a novel using through line and sequence with my novel Akuta. But let's turn our attention to this often used but rarely talked about tool called, well at least I call it, micro descriptions. But you can't spend the entire length of a novel writing a description of a place or a character. And honestly, something has to actually happen in the story. And there's this technique that's used, this technique I'm talking about, which allows you to get the same sort of result as like maybe 3 or 4 pages of a description of a character. And to do that by spreading it and attaching it to dialogue over time throughout the novel. And of course, that is what I'm talking about today, and it's called micro, in my opinion, micro descriptions, right? Okay. So how does it work? You will notice this. If you go pick up any book that you have, flip it open to where a character walks into a scene. So the character walks into the scene, they say something, there's a little description of the character, they say something else. It's that simple. So I'm going to show you a couple examples, and the first one I'm going to choose is from George R.R. Martin. Now, I chose George for a very specific reason. I don't think he's a melodic or a poetic writer. I think if you read his books, you're not going to say, oh my goodness, this is the best language, most beautiful language I've ever seen. What he does very, very well is he layers micro descriptions throughout his entire work. So here's an example. Again, it's from the Game of Thrones Book 1, Song of Ice and Fire. I'm just going to have it over here. I'm going to read it here, okay? The rustling grew louder. Bran heard muffled footfalls and a low humming, and Hodor came blundering out of the trees, naked and smiling. Hodor! You must have heard our voices, Bran said. Hodor, you forgot your clothes. Hodor, Hodor agreed. He was dripping wet from the neck down, steaming in the chill air. His body was covered with brown hair, thick as a pelt. So you should see on the highlighted bits, the part where he's doing Martin is doing little micro descriptions of Hodor. And so that the reader is anchored into who that character is, and he doesn't slow the story down because things are happening, they're talking. So instead of having a big block, he could have taken a big block of writing and said, Hodor, the giant that came in wearing the big hairy and looked like his mother or whatever else. He could have spent probably 2 or 3 pages doing that. He would have really slowed the story down though. But here he accomplished the same task by doing micro descriptions embedded right after the dialogue to get the same end for the writer. And here's another example, and this one's from my story Threshold in the book Origins. So in here, this is a little bit more succinct in that it's less complicated than the Martin description. It follows the pattern much more closely. The character comes in, says something, there's a description, character says something else. They came a little over a month ago, hit us hard, Teresa was stating. She was a comely woman in her early 40s with shoulder-length blonde hair and eyes that changed from green to gray as she turned her head, and the dim phosphorescent light refracted from her pupils. They who? Sergeant Cade asked. Don't know, the mine's medical doctor, David McCall, answered. He was average build and height, and his left arm was in a sling. He looked gaunt. Hell, Cade thought. They all did. So I'm doing the same thing Martin's doing. Here comes the character, a little micro description of the character. The next character steps in, a little micro description, and then I'm using the main character, Sergeant Cade, to project his feelings about how these people look by saying they look gaunt, to kind of wrap up and to color the reader's view of these 2 new characters, so that I don't have to spend 2 pages saying that they look hungry and tired and all that stuff. I do it right there. Hell, Kate thought. They all did. So it's a way to keep the story pace moving along. And then here's another example from my story, A Season for Killing, which is also in Origins. And again, this is much more of a simplistic use of this technique. Martin's was a little bit more complicated. Okay. No sign. A gruff voice protruded into Jordan's thoughts. She jumped and looked up to where a dark figure stood, unmoving in an alcove of the nearest apartment building. "Mr. Wara, is that you?" Jordan said. Her heart was in her chest. "Yeah, kid," he replied. He stepped out into the meager light. He wore a long, dark coat. His left hand was in one of the pockets, and he cupped a cigarette in his right hand. He took a long draw on the cigarette, and his face was lit ruby red from the burning end of the tobacco rod. It wasn't until he shifted and the front of his coat opened momentarily that Jordan saw the small, snub-nosed assault rifle tucked neatly against his body. "I didn't see any sign of them," Jordan admitted. She looked back the way she had come. "Do you think they are okay?" So again, you have Mr. War saying something. "Hey kid," he replied. And then there's a micro description. I could have spent all day long describing Mr. War standing up against the back of this apartment building at night in kind of a shady, shadowy part, smoking a red cigarette. I could have described him from head to foot, to the color of his shoes and socks, his eyes, his teeth, nicotine stains on his fingers and all that stuff. And it probably would have been a nice description, but you know what? It would have slowed the story down, and this is not the main, he's not a main character in the story, so micro description. But it is important because it has an emotion, this leads to an emotional moment for the protagonist Jordan a little bit later in the story. So I did have to describe him somewhat and make him human. And if you were to read that story, you'd say there's a little bit of a couple additional microburst descriptions of his life that I do within the context of dialogue, so that he becomes a real person and not just this cardboard cutout. And so by the time that something else happens in the story, the effect is on a human person and not just on this trope that's thrown in there for no particular reason. So it's probably occurred to you that you've seen micro descriptions both in terms of character descriptions and location descriptions, probably everything you've ever read. And you're thinking, geez, Dan, why are you talking about it? It's because it's so obvious that teachers never talk about it. If you're a writing instructor, you probably have never pointed this out to your students. Use a micro description. Keep the story moving along. You've probably never done a drill where you write a description of a character and take 2 pages and then split that into 20 different little tidbits and embed it in dialogue. And you can see the speed of that story increases considerably when you do that. And at the end, you still have the same description. So it's important if you decide you want to be a professional writer that you understand that this is a technique that almost every writer, any writer I've ever seen, except maybe a poet, and even poets use it to a certain extent, they use it. It's a tool in their toolbox. And that's why you have to recognize it for what it is. And it's one of those forest for the trees sort of things. It's there right in front of you, but you don't see it because it's so small and you're so used to it. But now you can recognize it when you pick up your book and you read it, and then you can use that next time you write your own story. So that's it for today. Sorry it's been a while since my last video, but like I said, I moved to the other side of the world, and I know that the video quality and the sound probably isn't all that great with this recording because I don't have any of my kit yet. I don't have any of my stuff. I still have a golden couch that I'm sitting on instead of my nice little leather couch that I like. But I wanted to stop by and talk to you a little bit about the craft of writing again. And I'd like to hear some of your little tricks of the trade if you're a writer. Stick them in the comment box below, and maybe we can talk about them. And let me see what you think about this as a technique, if you've recognized it before or not. So, with all that said, don't forget to like and share my videos, and check me out on Goodreads. I'm a Goodreads author. Have a great week, and I will see you all next time.